There's nothing uglier than a middle-aged unemployed who's gotten plump. Just putting you in sight is unpleasant. And infertile, too. Is there any need for you to be a woman? There's no need for you to be married, so just hurry up and leave. As a woman and as a wife, it's shameful, and I don't want to be associated with you. From now on, Dan and I will be happily living here with my mom. You're an eyesore, so leave. Despite them being the ones to suggest living together, why do I have to be the one to leave? I wanted to complain, but I had been wanting to leave if I could. So I decided to leave the very next day. Half a year later, to my surprise, Mary came to me, furious as fire, blaming me. But in my arms was a newborn baby, and upon seeing this, Mary made an outrageous statement and took shocking action. As a result, Mary's downfall began. I'm in my late 30s and work as a freelance writer. I started this job as a part-time job in college. After graduating, I planned to get a regular job. But I started receiving more offers from various places and ended up making writing my career. A few years ago, I married a younger man who worked at the same company. Although he's younger, we're both in our 30s, so I don't really feel like I married a younger man. I met Dan through work. Since we got married, he has been transferred to a different department and has been very busy. I want to support him, so I've been scaling back on my work a little. Thanks to the work I've done so far, our income hasn't suddenly decreased. So we're not struggling to live. Mary doesn't understand my job at all. She thinks that work means being employed and working outside the home. Due to my job, I often carry my smartphone around to gather information. Of course, I carry it around the house too, so I can immediately take notes on anything that catches my interest. But Mary thought I was just playing games. You're playing games on your smartphone again, aren't you? It must be nice to have your husband earn money while you indulge in games. I've also been nagged about how much I spend on games. I've had interference in household chores as well. As a couple, we do laundry every other day, but I was told laundry should be done daily. They say it's unhygienic, but it's not like we wear the same clothes for days on end. Dan and I don't live with my in-laws, but there's a reason Mary interferes in our life. First, I'm older than Dan. Moreover, there's little time left for me to have children in my late 30s. Since Dan is the eldest son, not being able to produce an heir is considered a disgrace to the family. All of this, according to Mary, is my fault. She seems to want to annoy me and make me leave Dan as soon as possible. I never expected to get along with Mary, who was strongly opposed to our marriage. And Dan had assured me from the start that we would not live with his parents. A year after our marriage, my father-in-law passed away. He was healthy and had never been hospitalized for illness or injury. So his death from a stroke, which occurred while he was asleep, was unexpected. After the funeral, after everything settled, the future of living with Mary was discussed. Given her severe depression, it was suggested that someone should live with her at the family home. Naturally, being the eldest son, it seemed most fitting for Dan to live with her. However, Dan knew that Mary and I did not get along and that she still could not accept our marriage. He firmly refused to live with her, although moving nearby was fine, but I felt uneasy. Mary, who would usually say she'd rather go to a home than live with me, didn't say anything and seemed to go along with what everyone else said. I suggested to Dan that we shouldn't rush our decision and should talk it over once more. After returning home, Dan and I discussed it thoroughly. He repeatedly told me that we shouldn't be swayed by temporary sympathy. But I couldn't shake off the sight of Mary being deeply depressed. And I wondered if there was a way to live with her amicably. As a result, we agreed that each of us would have our separate rooms. And there would be no interference with what was done inside those rooms. And thus began our cohabitation at the in-laws' house. Once we started living with Mary, I immediately received a baptism of bride harassment. The treatment was incomparable to when she used to just show up at our house and interfere. You're a full-time housewife, so don't you dare cut corners. Bath cleaning means cleaning from the walls to the floor. After you're done with that, go mow the lawn. Oh, and polish all the shoes. It was beyond what I could manage in between my work. When I went to the entrance, all the shoes from the shoebox were laid out. Some of them clearly had dirt intentionally put on them. Trying to gain even a little recognition from Mary, I spent time on housework instead of my job. The only way to meet the deadlines for my work was to cut back on sleep. However, not getting enough sleep led to more mistakes. And I started to be showered with words like slowpoke and winner from Mary. I had to go out for work meetings twice a month. The location of the meetings varied, but they were usually in cafes or hotel lounges. Sometimes, I received gifts. And bringing back bags from famous confectionaries always made Mary voice her dissatisfaction. A full-time housewife who doesn't work, splurging with her husband's earnings. If you have that much time, you should do more household chores as a wife. Even when I said the treats were not bought by me, Mary didn't believe me. There's no way someone would give a country bumpkin person like you any gifts. Mary often called me a country bumpkin person. At my late 30s, I was considered an auntie, and apparently, it would be better if at least I looked good, but I seem to have a dowdy countryside vibe. I rarely wear makeup because I work from home and I'm not into fashion. But is it right to tease someone about their appearance? If Mary says that about me, I have things I'd like to say about her appearance too. She's not so beautiful herself that she can comment on others. She looks like any other woman in her 60s. Her clothes are always similar, not showing much of a sense of beauty. But I've never pointed that out to her. What's with that look? You have something to say to me? Just so you know, I'm the one who has complaints. It seems Mary went through my room and rummaged through my things when I was not around. She started complaining about the increase in clothes and bags I had, calling it extravagant. Although I work from home, I do attend dinners and small parties as part of social obligations. I have the basic courtesy to dress appropriately. I would buy new clothes to avoid being rude, and accordingly, I would get new bags and shoes to match. Mary seemed to think I was making inappropriate purchases with Dan's earnings. But those were bought with my own money. She has no right to criticize me for that. Really, with that plump body, such flashy clothes don't suit you at all. She said it was embarrassing and that I should be grateful as she would dispose of them for me. This wasn't the first time she took away my clothes. I don't know how she disposed of them. The culmination of Mary's nagging attacks was always about infertility. It's hard for us to have children because I'm older than Dan. She would use this to pressure me to hurry up and leave him. At first, I endured it, thinking it was due to the loneliness and despair of suddenly losing my father-in-law. But as months passed, the harassment only got worse, and gradually, I could no longer endure Mary's torment. One day, the younger Kate, came to visit the family home. Still in her early 20s, the young and obedient Kate was very much liked by Mary. To me, their relationship seemed like one of absolute obedience, as Kate would readily accept whatever Mary said. Even when she made mistakes, her charming attitude prevented her from ever incurring Mary's wrath. While I'm criticized as a bad wife or slow learner due to my age, the treatment towards Kate is more forgiving, as if it's okay, because she's young. And it's all right for her to learn little by little. The treatment between Kate and me was as different as heaven and earth. I decided to finish household chores in the morning and reserved the afternoon to evening for work. Initially, Mary and I had a vague understanding about this. But once I took a firm stance not to do chores past noon, it caused an uproar. Mary, infuriated by my attitude, complained to Dan. But he said to let me have a few hours of freedom in the afternoon, which left her with nothing to say. For a while, I was able to concentrate on my work during the afternoon hours. But that became impossible once Kate started staying over every day. You're a shut-in unemployed wife. Since you're a barren old woman, at least do the housework properly. She kicked and broke my room's door. See, it's your fault, isn't it? You didn't come out even when called. I'll tell Mom that you broke it. Soon after, Mary entered my room yelling loudly. How dare you, an unemployed person, break things around the house? It's because you say such cheeky things as not doing housework in the afternoon. And shut yourself in that you're getting fatter. She grabbed my hair, dragged me out of the room, and I ended up scraping my elbows and knees. And a clump of my hair came out. I was shocked to be treated less than human. Looking up at Mary was frightening, so I kept my head down, but she forced me to look up. A barren unemployed wife is just a nuisance. Get out right now. When she let go of my hand, I stumbled and hit my nose on the corner of a pillar. Then, my Kate added insult to injury. It's decided that, Dan, and I will live with Mom. You're an eyesore, so get out. Despite being trampled on verbally many times before, this was physical. I did my best, but it was clear that Mary had discussed living with my brother-in-law and his wife behind my back, showing how much she detested my very existence. Eventually, whether tired of berating me or bored by my lack of reaction, Mary and Kate left me alone after a few minutes. Suffering from their presence, I waited for Dan's return in a corner of my room, holding my breath. Dan noticed something was wrong as soon as he came home late from work that night. And he seemed to understand what had happened. I had initially been positive about living with my in-laws, but I confessed that I had reached my limit. When I said I wanted to leave the in-laws' house, even if just by myself, Dan said we would leave together. The next day, Dan took a day off work, and we moved out in a hurry. Mary made a fuss, saying there was no need for Dan to leave, but he didn't listen to a word she said. We returned to our original home, free from Mary's harassment. When we had moved to the in-laws' house, Dan had suggested we keep our house, perhaps anticipating this situation. After we left, it seems my brother-in-law and his wife started living at the in-laws' house immediately. Mary had apparently contacted Dan several times, urging him to leave me and return. But he continued to ignore her until the calls stopped. Half a year later, I received a call from Kate. Initially, I wanted nothing to do with her and ignored her calls, thinking she was acting under Mary's orders. After ignoring several calls, I let one go to voicemail. In a frail voice, my Kate left a message saying, "Help me." It didn't seem like an act, and as a human being, I couldn't ignore someone asking for help. So I decided to respond to the next call. When I finally spoke to her, Kate was incredibly humble and begged just to be heard, so I listened. According to her, Mary had taken their bank books and cash cards. My brother-in-law's allowance was a mere $10 a month, and Kate received nothing. The rationale was that, as a housewife, she didn't need money. My brother-in-law couldn't even afford lunch money and had to skip meals. Mary strictly managed the food expenses and threatened to treat any attempt by Kate to make lunch for him as a debt, deducting it from his scant allowance. The private life of my brother-in-law and his wife was completely controlled by Mary, to the extent that they couldn't even freely use toilet paper without being monitored for excessive use. While my brother-in-law could escape his mother's surveillance by going to work, Kate felt watched even when outside, leading to significant mental stress. My brother-in-law has always been meek and unable to stand up to his mother, a trait that hasn't changed even in adulthood. Kate cried about the hardships and mental anguish they were enduring. From her story, I initially thought Mary was living the same life. But it turned out she was freely spending my brother-in-law and his wife's savings on herself, even indulging in expensive Italian while they suffered. Moreover, because she planned for her elder years to be looked after by my brother-in-law and his wife, she urged my brother-in-law to work more and also pressured Kate to find work, even if it was just piecework to do in her spare time if she had any. Initially, I thought I would just listen, but the situation was far worse than I had imagined, and I began to feel sympathy for my brother-in-law and his wife. However, the pain inflicted by Kate was deeply etched in my memory. Normally, one should not do to others what one dislikes, and doing what would make oneself happy to others is the right judgment. Responding to harassment with retaliation would never break the cycle. Above all, Kate was already suffering as if being punished for what she had done to me. As I struggled to find the words, my Kate began to share more about what happened 6 months ago. About 6 months ago, the reason she suddenly stayed at the in-laws' house and joined Mary in harassing me was because Mary had sought her help, claiming she was being harassed by the eldest son's wife to the point of being unable to sleep and feared being driven out. Suddenly, Mom contacted me, crying, saying she was living with the eldest son and his wife but was suffering from harassment by the daughter-in-law to the point she couldn't sleep. Believing she might be driven out by the daughter-in-law, I sided with her. Initially, Kate felt it served me right but became scared upon witnessing the harsh treatment and injuries inflicted by Mary. She regretted following Mary's directives, believing the lies about me retaliating or attacking while she slept. Believing her current plight was retribution, she endured but eventually felt her life was in danger and reached out to us, thinking we were the only ones who could help. It's hard to discern the truth from a phone call, and while I could be being deceived, I'd rather be deceived than deceive others. Being called naive is preferable to being called inhumane. With that mindset, I decided to assist my brother-in-law and his wife on the spot. First, I thought they needed financial assistance to leave the in-laws' house and start their own life. I waited for Dan to come home from his busy job and shared Kate's story with him, stating my decision to provide financial assistance. Dan suggested using our savings for the assistance, but since I had made the decision without consulting him, I insisted on providing the funds myself and refused to budge. There was another reason I couldn't compromise. I wanted to prove Mary wrong, who had ridiculed me as unemployed and looked down on me. 3 days after our conversation, my brother-in-law and his wife successfully escaped the in-laws' house. It was on a day Mary was out at the spa, using their money. Upon returning home, the house was completely dark, and the younger Kate was gone. There was just one letter left in the living room. From this letter, Mary learned that the younger brother and his wife had left, which enraged her greatly. Maintaining her fury, she came to our house and confronted me, demanding to know what kind of scheme this was. A letter left in the living room informed her that they had left, partly thanks to my assistance. You're unemployed, don't have the money to help others. How far will you go to trouble my son? Did you borrow from some dangerous places? If my son is chased by debt collectors, it's all your fault. Divorce him before that happens. Despite everything, Mary still believed I was just a shut-in unemployed. She failed to understand the concept of remote work, even though it had been widely discussed in the news years ago. I had been working diligently and Dan and I were both working. We had agreed to no interference in my work when we decided to live together in the in-laws' house. I showed her my bank book as proof, displaying a recent payment of approximately $30,000, which included royalties and fees for magazine articles. Having published several books, I believed I had a decent reputation in my field. Dan and I met when he was assigned as my editor during his early days. Now, he's working in a demanding department of a weekly manga magazine. He had introduced me as the first author I was in charge of. When we went to announce our marriage, but it seemed Mary hadn't been listening. Focused only on driving me out because I was older. Upon learning the truth, Mary was astonished to see the significant amount in the bank book. Realizing she had underestimated me. Then, as a baby's cry echoed from another room, she looked puzzled. I went to the room, picked up our newborn baby, and appeared before Mary with Dan, who had been watching the baby. We had discovered my pregnancy shortly after moving into the in-laws' house. Faced with increasing hostility from Mary, which posed a danger to our unborn child, we decided to return to our own home. Given the situation with Mary, we decided it was safer not to disclose my pregnancy, keeping it a secret during our cohabitation. Since we were leaving the in-laws' house, there was no need to inform her. I thought you were a barren old wife. You made that assumption yourself, Mom. But it would be embarrassing if people knew about a late pregnancy. According to the neighbors. You've always been like this, taking rumors at face value. Remember how you bought all those expensive water boxes based on gossip? Dad had to take on a huge debt because of that. Mary cut off Dan's reminiscing, claiming to have forgotten such old matters, and then completely disregarding our feelings. She demanded we return to the in-laws' house with the newborn baby. She even said it was a relief that my brother-in-law and his wife had left. We'll pass. Are you planning to live luxuriously by taking over my account next? I don't work to fulfill your greed. I agree. Don't ever come here again. I grabbed Mary's arm and pushed her out. She lingered for a while, pleading for us to reconsider with tears. But when Dan threatened to call the police due to the disturbance, she finally left. Despite several attempts to persuade us to live with her again, I steadfastly refused, and after persistent harassment, I actually reported her to the police. After which she never returned. Cut off from relying on Dan or brother-in-law's earnings. She apparently started dipping into the inheritance left by my father-in-law. As mentioned before, due to being swindled into buying expensive water by a neighbor's persuasion, there wasn't much inheritance left. The land and house were there, providing shelter, but that might have been the only silver lining. Unable to quit her luxurious habits, Mary quickly squandered the inheritance. She didn't stop there, without any repayment ability. She racked up debts from credit cards and loans. The amount was far beyond what could be repaid by merely working, leading to the loss of the ancestral home that had been in my father-in-law's family for generations. The house was too old to fetch a decent price, so the land had to be sold as well. Although the debts were settled, only a small amount remained, forcing her to rent a rundown apartment and work hard despite her old age. Having never worked even part-time before and with her nasty disposition, she struggled at work, always isolated and making mistakes. Returning to her apartment, no one awaited her. Without even a microwave to warm her meals, she lived a lonely life, eating cold, discounted bento boxes once a day. After being disowned by us, she shamelessly attempted to rely on my brother-in-law and his wife again. Unable to find their new residence, she ambushed my brother-in-law at his workplace, only to be chased away by security guards. Later, Kate contacted us, expressing deep gratitude for our help in escaping the in-laws' house. We began to share various experiences over the phone, deepening our relationship. I had assumed Kate was favored by Mary, but it turns out she was also a target of harassment before my marriage. While she wasn't controlled to the extent of having her bank book taken, she was subjected to unnecessary meddling. My brother-in-law personally thanked Dan, and from then on, our families began to associate closely. 3 months later, when Kate's pregnancy was confirmed, Our conversations grew even more intimate as she sought advice on my parenting experience. She appreciated the insights from someone who had been through it. Encouraged by this, I proposed writing an essay on my childbirth and parenting experiences to my current editor, who responded positively, indicating a busy period ahead. Balancing work and parenting is challenging but fulfilling. I feel my days are rich and rewarding. Dan has mentioned seeking a transfer to a more slow-paced job, appreciating the importance of being present during our child's early years. I am reminded daily of how fortunate I am to have such a wonderful husband and family.